Morning. Before we start, does anyone need a page of questions for today's class? We've got 2 questions left in the last set, but this will be getting into the page that's called Samuel and Saul Part 2. So if you need that page, you can raise your hand. I'll give it to you. I don't see any hands, so I think we're good. I think there's still some on the back if you end up needing some. We'll continue today with another class in our study of the Judges. My plan is that we are into the final month of our study of the Judges, but we got 5 Sundays in November, so we still got a lot to cover with Samuel. So we will plan on getting through that during November. Before we start, I've asked Bill, if you would, to lead us in prayer.
Most gracious God, we come to you this morning with humble hearts and a desire to learn more about your word. We ask that you be with us and all the congregations throughout the country that are endeavoring to do the same. Also be with the children of this congregation and other children that are studying your word this day, and encourage them to learn more and to be Christians, to receive baptism and for the forgiveness of their sins. We ask, Lord, that you continue to guide us and protect us and help those who can't be with us this day and studying your word, and hopefully they'll be following us in this class and be able to glean some knowledge and hope out of your word. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you. All right, so as we do every week to start our study of the Judges, I want to remember the cycle that happens throughout the time of the Judges. It starts with the Israelites forsaking God and turning to idolatry. So then God allows their enemies to defeat them. Then the people cry out to God for help in their distress. And so God sends a judge who delivers them from their oppressors. And then the land will be at peace for the rest of that judge's life until the people go back into idolatry again. And so the cycle repeats over and over throughout the Judges. The keynote verse kind of describes how the Judges works is, in those days there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes. So last week we were talking about Samuel. We've been talking about him for the last few weeks. But last week we talked about how the people made a request of Samuel. They said that they were tired of this arrangement of the judges, and they wanted a king. They wanted a king that would judge them like the other nations and lead them into battle. And so God told Samuel to grant their request, but that they were not rejecting Samuel. They were rejecting God as being their king. They had the perfect arrangement that God had given them. It only failed because of the failures on their end, that they weren't following God the way they should. But the people have had enough of this, and they want a king to make them like the other nations. And so God says, you can have your request. But he did warn them of the things that were going to happen because of having a king. So we saw last week that the man that God appointed to be their first king was identified, and that was Saul. And so we saw that his interaction with Samuel, and that Samuel anointed him as king. And then we saw how he had the Spirit of the Lord come on him that gave him that made him more prepared to be the king and leader over Israel. So last week we got down through question 4 of the Samuel and Saul part 1 set of questions. So we've got 2 questions left on that page, and then we'll move on to the newest set of questions I gave. So let's get into question 5. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 10. And for this question, we're in verses 17 through 24. So who did Samuel say was responsible for delivering the Israelites all the previous times in their history when they didn't have a king? Yes. So Samuel gives them an address here when it's time to identify their king. And 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 17, it says, "Therefore Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah. And he said to the sons of Israel, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought Israel up from Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the power of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who delivers you from all your calamities and your distresses. Yet you have said, No, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans." So this is going to be, this is going to set up the way that the king will be identified, because at this point, Samuel has been told who's going to be the king, and he communicated that to Saul, but it's not otherwise known who this king would be. So the second part of that question, what was the method used for determining the king that God would give them?
Thinking about law.
Yes. And so that's a lot of times was the procedure done during the time of the Old Testament, that it was casting lots was used to determine the judgment of God. And so that's the method they're going to use for the king to be identified. So in verse 20 it says that Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families, and the Matrite family was taken, and Saul the son of Kish was taken. And so now it's identified and publicly known that Saul is going to be the first king. But does Saul then make a grand entrance as he's identified as the king here? See. Yes. You would expect that, if this king was identified, that he would make a grand entrance and be, standing out in that way. But when he's identified as being the one to be king, it says in verse 21, "But when they looked for him, he could not be found." And so then it says in verse 22, "Therefore they inquired further of the Lord, Has the man come here yet?" And so God tells them where he is. And so where is Saul at this point?
Since he's hiding with the baggage, among the baggage, I don't know exactly what that means unless they had all come and they had all their goods or what with them while they're here. But evidently he's kind of back in the background, trying to be inconspicuous. So.
Yeah, we see that from the early times. The first things that we see with Saul here, that he doesn't seem to be very outspoken. We know when Samuel first tells him about all these great things that he would get, that's when he says, "Am I not a Benjamite, the smallest of the tribes of Israel? My family is the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin." So at this point, we see that Saul doesn't seem to think much of himself. As we go through the history of Saul, we know that eventually he's going to become very, very prideful. But at this point, he's kind of trying to stay out of the spotlight. And so God reveals where he's hiding. And so in verse 23, it says that they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upwards. And Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there is no one like him among all the people." So all the people shouted and said, "Long live the king." I find it interesting at this point. What is it about Saul that makes him notable as king at this point? What is it that they're noticing?
He's real tall.
Yes, so it's the physical attributes, right? They're saying, "Oh, look at he's tall, he's strong, he looks like someone that would be a great king," but that's not necessarily what makes for the best king. And we're going to see here that I talked about this some last week, that this is kind of God's going to teach them a lesson here of like, I'm going to give you the king that looks like the king you want, but it turns out he doesn't have the correct heart that would make him the king that they needed. And so then when it's time for the second king, when David enters the picture, God shows them, okay, this is what a king that's got the hearts that I want looks like. But they had to learn their lesson here with Saul, that just because he looked physically impressive doesn't mean that he was a great fit to be their king. So, but it's at this point now that Saul has been identified as being the king, and there's a lot of excitement about this first king. The people are getting their request, so we'll see how it works out for them. Any comments on question 5? Okay. Finish up chapter 10 of this page of questions. Question 6, what was Samuel's role in setting up the arrangement of this new kingdom?
He was the one that told the people the ordinances that would be in effect, and
Yeah.
even wrote it in a book, placed it before the Lord, and send all the people back to their own house.
This is one I hadn't really noticed this in the past, but I thought this was really impressive. That it says there in verse 25, then Samuel told the people the ordinances of the kingdom and wrote them in the book and placed it before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his house. So again, we see all these ways in which Samuel is having this impact on the people. And in this case, we see that even though, Samuel's not a king, he basically gets to be the one to set up the structure of the kingdom. That he's the one that's through, God's direction that's going to set up the arrangement of how this kingdom would be. So I think that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that before. That Samuel basically gets to be the one to set up the structure of the kingdom through God's direction, of course.
And, it says he told the people the ordinances of the kingdom, he wrote them in a book. I'm wondering, when I always read this, I always wondered if he didn't go back to what God had told him to say, this is the kind of king you're going to get. So you now owe him a tenth of your goods. Not
Right.
only do you have to pay him, but you also still have to give the tenth that you owe the Levites, to maintain the priesthood and all of that stuff. So
Right.
now, it's not sounding so good.
Mhm.
I think it was, your dad was telling when David went against Goliath, one of the ordinances was, or the rewards was, you'll be tax-free. And I
Pretty
think
good
it was
benefit.
your grandfather that said, I'm kind of like my aunts.
Yeah.
Either way, I'm not gonna have to pay taxes.
Right.
But, you think about now, all that's fixing to take place. And I'm not so sure that people thought that through.
Yeah.
That happens even today. We don't think things through
Mhm.
until it's too late, and then we gotta go back and try to change it.
They basically raise their own taxes on themselves with this setting up of a king. So it's kind of like, things like that can happen in our society today, that we want these different things to happen. We'd like a big fancy new stadium for our football team to play in, but guess who's going to pay for it? It's got to come out of taxes. So these are why there's things that being short-sighted here, that not thinking of the long-term consequences, and that's what the people here, they saw, we want to be like the nations around us. We want a king, someone that'll lead us into our battles, but they missed all of the consequences that would come from that. But God grants them their request. He's going to give them what they want, but he does warn them what's going to happen. But I think it is interesting too that it's like that you see the influence that Samuel has over the people, that they didn't just take it on their own to say, we're going to make ourselves a king and we're going to decide how all that works. You see, they make this request, but then it's going to be, God's not going to let them decide for themselves how this is going to be structured. He says, okay, if you want a king, I'm going to give you the structure. This is what your setup with the king is going to look like. And Samuel's the one that gets to be the one set up. So that's another, if you're making a list of all the ways, all the things that Samuel did and all the roles he had for the people, in this way, you could count him as like a lawmaker, basically. Obviously, God's the one making these rules, but Samuel's the one that gets to detail them out. And so another entry to the list, the long list of roles that Samuel takes in leadership over the people. So It's one of the great things about when you study things in the Bible. There's always things like that that stand out that you didn't really notice before. So I'd noticed before that Samuel's the one that kind of sets up the structure of the kingdom. So pretty cool. You think about all the kings that come after Saul and David, that structure that goes on for hundreds of years. The structure of that set up here by Samuel. Anything else on question 6? Okay. So let's move on now, and we're going to kind of do at a high level this next chapter, chapter 11, because again, we're talking about Samuel, and there's not much mentioned about Samuel here, so just kind of at a very high level talk about this chapter 11. So question 7, this is on the Samuel and Saul part 2 set of questions. Question 7, what event helps to establish Saul's rule here in chapter 11?
Cut up the oxen into 12 pieces and basically settle across the land.
Yes.
Come with me.
Saul, as we see him taking a position of leadership over the people. We see in this chapter that Saul, he rallies Israel to rescue the people of Jabesh Gilead, who are being besieged by the Ammonites. So we see in this chapter that the people of Jabesh Gilead are being besieged by the Ammonites, and they're looking for someone to rescue them, so they send messengers out and to Israel to look for help. And so when Saul hears about it, it says in chapter 6, then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. And then that's when he does what you were saying, Tom, that he takes the oxen and cuts them into pieces and sends them out through Israel, telling them, whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. And so this causes Israel to respond. And so this is one we talk about. There's so many examples from this time period where you see Israel's army, very much outnumbered by the enemy. But this is one example where you see Israel coming together with a large force. It says in verse 8 that there's 300,000 of their soldiers and 30,000 from Judah. And so Saul leads the people into battle and defeats the Ammonites there. And so that's kind of the event that makes the people, they all kind of rally together under Saul, and it helps to establish Saul's kingdom there. So the second part of that question, what did Samuel advise the people to do when you get down to verses 14 and 15 of chapter 11? So verse 14, Samuel says, the people, come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. So all the people went to Gilgal, and therefore they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. And there they also offered sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So now this is the point where Saul is officially becoming their king, and people are very, very happy at this time, and there's a lot of rejoicing there in Israel. Saul, with the Spirit of God coming on him there, delivered the people of Jabesh Gilead from the Ammonites, and this helps to establish his rule here over Israel. So now we have, when we get into chapter 12, we have this address that Samuel gives Israel. It kind of seems like it's kind of picture it as being his somewhat final address of like his kind of, he's been the one that's been in leadership over Israel. Now he's turning over the keys of the kingdom to Saul. And so this is Samuel kind of giving his message to the people, and kind of signing out of his role of being the main leader over Israel. So let's get into question 8 and get into chapter 12 and see what Samuel has to say. So question 8, how long had Samuel been leading and serving Israel? We've been talking about Samuel for a while, right? When was it that he started being involved with serving Israel? Started from the very beginning. It was from a very young age that he was doing that. So we see in verse 1, Samuel says, "Behold, I have listened to your voice and all that you have said to me, and I have appointed a king over you. Now here is the king walking before you, but I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. And I have walked before you from my youth, even to this day." So what we're going to see Samuel do here is he's going to show them that he is, he's been serving them. He hasn't been acting in his own selfish interest. He's been serving on their behalf. So second half of that question, had Samuel ever defrauded the people or taken any bribes? No, we see in verse 3, he says, "Here I am, bear witness against me before the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? I will restore it to you." They said, "You have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand." He said to them, "The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you have found nothing in my hand." And they said, "He is witness." So we know when the people tell Samuel that they want a king, God tells Samuel that they're not rejecting him, that they're rejecting God as being their king. So ultimately, they're rejecting God. But in a way, they're also, rejecting having Samuel being the leader that God designated over them. And so I feel like this is Samuel kind of taking a moment to say, have I done anything to defraud you? Have I ever been, taking bribes or perverting justice? And so he's saying that, you're rejecting me being the leader over you, but I've served you faithfully my whole life. And so he's saying that, making God the witness against them, that he had served them faithfully all the days of his life and done what he was supposed to, what the position that God had appointed him to. So I think this is kind of his moment to say, if you're moving on from me being your judge, and having me implement this king, but just know that it's, I haven't done anything to defraud you or take bribes or anything, but I've served you faithfully for all my time. Anything on question 8? Any other comments? Okay. Let's continue on and see what else Samuel has to say to the people. So question 9, what events did Samuel recount from Israel's history to remind them what God had done for them? This is in chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. Yes. So this is not the first or last time that this is recounted. Very common thing for to be recounted throughout the Old Testament. Samuel says to the people, "It is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. So now take your stand, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which he did for you and your fathers." You could say that Samuel's taking a moment to tell of all God's wonders at this point. In verse 8, "When Jacob went into Egypt and your fathers cried out to the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place." And so we see that God was the one that appointed. My questions went too far. God said that it was that he was the one that appointed, or Samuel's saying that God was the one that appointed Moses and Aaron. I don't know how we got that far ahead, but anyway, that's where we're supposed to be. So God is the one given credit by Samuel here for bringing the Israelites up to this point, and giving them the land there, bringing them out of Egypt and settling them in the land of Canaan. A very familiar story, of course, we've heard about many times. So continuing through that in question 10, we see that Samuel recounts from the time period of the judges that we've been talking about. So this is a little bit of a review right here. And so in verses 9 through 11 on question 10, lists the three enemies from the time of the judges that Samuel recounts. First part of that. Yeah, so the three that he brings up here in verse 9 of the enemies that they encountered during this time period of the judges. It says in verse 9 that they forgot the Lord their God, and again, this is kind of him talking about the cycle of the judges that we talked about. They forgot the Lord their God, they started serving idols, and so he sold them into the hand of Sisera, captain of the army of Hazor. So who was it that was judge during the time of Sisera? Yes, that was the one we talked about. Deborah way back at the fourth judge. She was the one that was judge at that point. And then the second one, it's mentioned into the hand of the Philistines. There's several cases where the Philistines are mentioned, including Shamgar, Samson, Eli, and Samuel. Philistines were all involved in those time periods. And then also into the hand of the king of Moab. Do you remember which judge went against the king of Moab? Yeah, that'd be Ehud. He was the one that had the dagger that he used to stab the king. It says they fought against them. And then this is the part of the step on the cycle where they turn back to God for help in their distress. It says in verse 10 that they cried out to the Lord and said, "We have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. But now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you." And so at this point, in verse 11, Samuel brings up 4 deliverers that God appointed. So list those 4 deliverers that God sent to rescue the people, mentioned there in verse 11.
And this Jerubbaal, Bedan, Jephthah, and Samuel.
Right. And so he says that these 4 delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around so that you lived in security. And so it makes this last couple steps. Yeah, so the four that he's talking about there, so Jerubbaal is the same as Gideon. And where was that? Do you remember how Gideon got the name Jerubbaal, where that name came from?
It was his father, wasn't it, that, ended up calling him Jerubbaal because he said, he told the people that were with him, will you defend Baal? Let Baal defend himself.
Right, because God told Gideon to tear down the altar to Baal there. And so when the people find out about this, they're upset with Gideon and they want to punish him for this. And Gideon's father says, let Baal he'll be the one to contend with Gideon. And so that's where the name Jerubbaal came from, because he said, let Baal contend with him. And so we see him, that Gideon, or Jerubbaal is mentioned here. Who is Bedan? Who is it when the second one mentioned there, it says Bedan? Anyone know who that is? There's a different name for that person that you might have a note. Yeah, so it's, for some reason, it's the name Bedan is mentioned there, but it's the person being talked about there is Barak. And so we talked about Sisera before. Barak was the one that Deborah called to lead the people into battle against Sisera. And so, of course, we know that there was a whole event where he hesitated and would only go if Deborah came. And so Deborah said that she would go, but the victory would go to, or the hero of the battle would not be him. But at the same time, we talked about it way back then, that it's easy for us to kind of criticize Barak for that. But we see him mentioned here along with these other heroes of this time period of the judges. So he still is someone to be recognized for the victory that he was able to achieve, that God brought for them. The third one mentioned there is Jephthah. Remember we talked about him before. He was the one that made the foolish vow. But again, that's where we can kind of look on him poorly for that, which it was a foolish thing that he did. But at the same time, we see him mentioned here as being a hero of this time period, that he was a valiant warrior that brought victory for the Israelites from the Ammonites at this time. So he's mentioned there. And then the fourth one that Samuel mentions is himself. That Samuel was another one that God had appointed for this role of judging the people, bringing them success and deliverance from their enemies during this time period. And so Samuel's recounting here this part of their history, that this arrangement that God had with the judges, delivering them. And so again, we see the reason that there was problems in this time period was because the people, back there at the start of verse 9, because they kept forgetting God and turning to idols, and so God was punishing them for that. And then when they turned back to him and were faithful, that's when God used those judges to deliver them. And so we see here Samuel just recounting this history there to remind them, here's what God's done for you. And don't forget that God's done all these things to deliver you from all your oppressors. Any comments on question 10? Okay. So continuing on through Samuel's message to the people. So question 11, what was Samuel's message to the Israelites that they and their king needed to do to have success in the future? What's something they needed to learn from what he's recounted here through the time of the judges? Yes. We see over and over throughout this time period, he keeps telling them over and over again, what you need to do is follow God fully. Don't forsake God. Don't go to these idols. As long as you do that you'll have success. So he keeps reminding them over and over again. So we see in verse 12, chapter 12, verse 12, he says, when you saw that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, although the Lord your God was your king. Now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen, whom you have asked for, and behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him, and listen to his voice, and not rebel against the command of the Lord, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God. If you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you, as it was against your fathers. So we see, even with this new arrangement, God's not pleased with them seeking this arrangement, but he says, it's, same as in their previous history, as long as they're following God, fearing the Lord, serving him, listening to his voice, not rebelling against the command of the Lord, then God's going to give them success, whether it's in the time period before their king or now that they have the king. God's going to give them success as long as they're faithful to him. So God says, it's the same as what you had before. If you were faithful during the time of the judges, God give them success. But if they were unfaithful, then God was going to punish them. And so same here, now that they've got a king, if they're faithful and they follow God, God's going to give them and their king success. But if they turn away from God, God's going to punish them, same as he did when they were under the time period of the judges. So second part of that question, what would happen if they did otherwise from serving God? Yeah, so it says, again, there's several of these spots where he's saying the same thing. In verse 21, Samuel says, you must not turn aside, for then you would go after futile things which cannot profit or deliver, because they are futile. For the Lord will not abandon his people on account of his great name, because the Lord has been pleased to make you a people for himself. So he's saying here how it's futile for them to turn aside to follow idols, because those idols and the things of the nations around them cannot deliver them from their enemies. Only God can be the one to give them deliverance. And then in verses 24 and 25, he says again, only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. And then in verse 25, but if you still do wickedly, both you and your king will be swept away. So, God set up this king for them, but if they're not going to follow God, then he says, I'm going to sweep both you and your king away. you'll be punished for this. And we know eventually throughout the history of Israel, eventually they become so wicked that God eventually wipes them out with their king. That's when they get taken into captivity. So they should have listened to Samuel here, but throughout their history, they end up forgetting this. Yep.
He gives them a sign that God means business when he talks about this stuff, because he brings the thunder and the rain.
Right.
They're trying to harvest their wheat.
Mhm.
And it's raining that day, so it puts fear in their minds.
Right.
And they have to ask Samuel to pray for them.
Mhm.
And of course, he said that he would continue to pray for them, as well as continue to instruct them in God's law.
Right. Yeah, so we see that Samuel's going to give them a little extra incentive to make them, to put the fear into them that they need to follow God. Talking about the wonders that we were talking about earlier today, this would be one of those in that category.
Lessons from Little House, that if it rains on the day you've got a harvest and your grain's on the ground, it's ruined, it's not any good at all. So
Yes.
he basically threatened their entire existence for the next year, their food supply. by
Right.
doing this.
Yeah, so that's good to have the context for that, because you see here in, in verse, starting in verse 16, where Samuel says that he's going to call on the Lord to bring thunder and rain, and then he calls on the Lord and he brings thunder and rain. So, on the surface, it might be like, oh, how, that doesn't seem all that impressive. It could, thunder and rain at any point. So that's like, what's impressive about that? But yeah, we see because of of it being the context of it being right there at the time of harvest, that this is Samuel showing God's power, that reminding them that they need to fear God and that they're reliant on God to deliver them, because it's significant that it's during the time of the wheat harvest that he calls on God to bring the thunder and rain, and God responds in that way. And so what was the response of the people to that?
Samuel prayed to God and they would not die, but they would have any food to die.
Yeah. So we see that they're greatly afraid of the Lord and Samuel at this point, at the end of verse 18, and then that's where we see in verse 19 that that they tell Samuel, "Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, so that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king." And so then Samuel's response in verse 20 is, "Do not fear, you have committed all this evil, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart." So we see at this point, there's no going back from this king arrangement, right? The king is set up, and that's the way that it's going to be set up at this point. There's no going back and undoing what's been done. But God's wanting to send a message to the people, and remember that you're reliant on me. You can't rely on yourselves. So you're going to have this new arrangement with the king, but you can't rely on your king to be the one to deliver you. God is still the one that's going to do the delivering. Yeah.
And it's interesting that they say, pray for us because of what we've done, for we've added to all of our sins by this evil. So they recognize that they've done bad.
Right.
But it's like you said, Samuel tells them, too late.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you can receive forgiveness, but it's too late. You're going to have to suffer the consequences.
Yeah, and God knew the people's hearts, right? That there was no going back at this point. That their hearts were such that they wanted to have the structure with the king. They wanted to be like the nations around them. So even if at this moment they're remorseful and they've got sorrow for what they've done, God knows it's not going to last very long. That if they remove the king structure, they would only come back and want a king later. So they're too far gone at this point that they're going to have like the time period for them to have the judge arrangement is done. Now they're into this setup with the king, but God's going to, emphasize to them, you've got to still rely on me. You've got to follow me. Your king is not going to deliver you if you're not going to serve me anymore. But yeah, it's interesting that they acknowledge their evil here, but it doesn't necessarily change their minds on this arrangement with the king here. Last question in that section, in question 13, and you talked about this a minute ago, Kevin, did Samuel still have a role in the leadership of the Israelites even with the addition of their new king? So this doesn't mean that Samuel is just fading out of the picture, right? He's still very much involved with the people. So I think this is another cool one that you kind of see looking at the character and the role of Samuel. Here in chapter 12, verse 23, Samuel says, "Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, but I will instruct you in the good and right way." So we see two roles that Samuel has here. You can add to the list of all of Samuel's roles. What are the two things that we see that Samuel does for the people here?
Pray for them, and to teach them right there.
Right. So see, he's their spiritual leader by being the one to pray for them. He's that mediator between the people and God. He says that he would not sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for them. Then he also says that he will instruct them in the good and right way. So he's also in that role of being the teacher over the Israelites. So again, if you make a list of everything that Samuel did for Israel, it gets to be really long. But that's another one you see that he's their spiritual leader when it comes to being that kind of the bridge between them and God, and he's the one that's instructing them, teaching them what they needed to do. So again, just adding on more and more things that we just see the extraordinary person that Samuel was and all the roles that he took on. There's few people in the Bible that have as many. There's influential on the people of their time as Samuel. He's up there with people like Moses, I think. So it's good. I think he's one we don't always think about him in the same tier as Moses and David and people like that. But I think you could say he definitely belongs in that group. Some of the most extraordinary examples of people from the Old Testament. Any other comments on there in chapter 12, talking about Samuel's address to the people? Okay. We are just about out of time, so I'll do one more question here. Looking into chapter 13, we're now switch back to looking at Saul and what Saul's going to do. So, question 14 at the bottom of the page there. What familiar foe came to fight with the Israelites?
Philistines.
Yes, Philistines are back to cause trouble again. So we see here Saul was 32 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 42 years over Israel. So a long time that he ends up being in charge of, or being in the position of king over Israel. And so we see that Saul arranges an army for himself here. I realized by the way I worded the second part of the question, it might not be clear who I was talking about, the size of their army, but could go either way. So what was the size of Saul's army here? Does he have?
Relatively small,
Yeah,
6,000.
he doesn't have the 3,000 or the 300,000 that we see when they fought against Jabesh Gilead. At this point, he has a smaller army with him. So it says he has an army of 3,000, 2,000 of them that were with Saul, and then the other 1,000 men. Who is it that the other 1,000 men are with? So we haven't talked about Jonathan yet up to this point, but what is Saul's relation to, or what is Jonathan's relation to Saul? Yes, so we read a lot more about Jonathan when you get into the story of David. Doesn't really overlap with Samuel, so we're not going to talk about him very much, but there's a lot you can learn about Jonathan through there. Very impressive character. And we see here that that he fights against the Philistines and is victorious, and the Philistines hear about this, and so then we see that Saul, it says he blows the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And so all Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to Saul at Gilgal. And so there in verse 5, what is the size of the Philistine army?
They've got 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and the people are described as like the sand of the seashore.
Yeah, so it doesn't even give a number of the total people that they had, but if they had 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, gotta imagine that is a humongous army. And so, with 3,000 versus, 30,000 chariots on their own, they're very much outnumbered here. And so it says that when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were hard pressed, then the people hid themselves in caves and thickets and cliffs and cellars and in pits. Also some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead, but as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So they've got they're in a tough spot here with the Philistines coming against them, and so we're going to see this is going to be a test for Saul to see how he responds to this situation. And so we will look at that next week, see how Saul responds to the situation, and if he handles it correctly. So,
Well, it says he was 30 when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years.
yeah.
So between that verse and then what's being told after that, there's got to have been a long period of time, because all of a sudden Jonathan's grown and leading
True.
1,000 men against a garrison of Philistines. So you
Yeah.
kind of go, we jumped a lot of years between verse 1 and verse 2.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't give an exact time period for it, but it's a long stretch where Saul is reigning, so this could be a decent ways further there. Yeah.
My version actually says that he was 40 years old and he reigned for 32 years. I'm not sure what the discrepancy is, but
Interesting.
then the New King James doesn't even mention that. It says that Saul would reign 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, then it goes into verse 2. So completely.
Interesting. There seems to be some different translations of how that works, I guess. Because, and I would just say, because in mine it's kind of like in italics there, so it's like they kind of filled that in. So, interesting. I might look into that, why there's a difference on that one. So, we will talk about all of that more next week. Thank you all for the comments. Travis, could you read?